Hi there, Stephen Roselle, everybody. Happy holidays. This is my annual Roselle Holiday Card blog post where I'm going to cover the making of our annual holiday card. For those of you that don't know, my wife Susie and I have an ongoing tradition of creating our own holiday cards. We've been doing it for about 16 years, and we always do it based on the previous Halloween costumes that were basically handmade. And we incorporate our kids as well. This year, the theme is Wreck-It Ralph. So if I pull in here, you can see there my son Henry's Wreck-It Ralph, and then my daughter Vanellope, me is Felix, and my lovely wife is Sergeant Calhoun. Um, so I did the background, the 3D image, and then my wife is a designer and she does all the 2D work. So she does most of the Photoshop work and anytime there's a font or whatever and all the comping and everything. So I used as a reference a poster shot or render for a poster or a banner or whatever it was for Wreck-It Ralph. So I just kind of used this as inspiration. I didn't copy it verbatim, but I just used it as kind of a general inspiration. I changed the color scheme a little bit, but in general, I kind of tried to follow along with this just so it would feel more authentic. Um, Obviously, I didn't do near the quality as Disney did, but I did my best given a short amount of time. So I'm going to go over the process of basically taking this background as a reference, building it in 3D, and then how my wife essentially comped photographs of us. This is just a group shot, but we did a little mini photo shoot for this individually. And again, we comped it all together into a final card. So anyway, I'm going to spend a few minutes just going over mostly the 3D stuff that I did in Maya, since this is a Maya blog, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the 2D stuff that my wife did on the comp in. So this is what it kind of looks like in rough form in Maya. The way I did this basically is as a kind of initial layout, I brought in the characters as individual objects. So actually I've got those set up, not as image planes, but uh, as actual 3D planes. And then those are linked to the camera. So if I move the camera, those guys will rotate and adjust to kind of face the camera. So I just did that initially basically as kind of a starting point for the placement of the characters, or us in this case. And then my wife used that as a reference later when she did the Photoshop comping. So if I just hide the image planes and get rid of the foreground, I can show some of the stuff that I did for the background. So first of all, I've got my camera gate mask on, so I'll just turn that off, and you can see here the actual full environment. So basically I wanted to do this as quickly as possible, so I didn't want to have a lot of rendering time, but I wanted as much quality as I could get. So I did a lot of fakery. I used mental ray to render, but I didn't use anything fancy, just basic ray tracing. So of course the tree itself is pretty basic. If I bring up the foreground here, which actually is all this stuff right here, the tree is basically just a simple extruded object with a bunch of extruded branches, nothing fancy there. So if I just hide this, then I'll get into some of the other stuff. The terrain, of course, is just very simple itself. If I go in and just unreference the terrain, you can see basically that I just took a lot of different pieces. So I have my foreground, I have kind of a midground brown, and then I've got a second midground, and then I've got a distant background. So I just did really, really basic stuff when it comes to the actual layers of terrain. I didn't want to spend a lot of time rendering it. So this allowed me to apply different textures to kind of each depth. So I can have a different texture from the foreground, from the midground, from the background, and then I can apply special effects and tricks to create kind of a depth-like effect without actually using real depth map rendering tricks. This is all simple illusion. So if I get rid of the terrain, we can talk a little bit about the water. The water is actually an ocean. So if I bring up the water here, you can see here that I've got a simple ocean, which is basically just part of dynamics. So if you go to dynamics, if you haven't used this before, under fluid effects, we've got create ocean and we've got create pond. I could have used a pond, but in this case I used an ocean just because no particular reason. I just more familiar with the oceans, but they work basically the same way. The difference with the ocean is it's infinite, but in this case it got clipped by the terrain anyway, so it didn't really matter. So if I play this back, what you'll see is I've got some basic animation. It's a little bit hard to see here in the 3D view, but what I've got is a ripple effect. So I'm just using the simple ocean shader and a preview plane to actually preview this kind of wave effect. But what I did with these gumdrops is I dropped the gumdrops in, and then I basically surrounded the gumdrops with simple little wake effectors. So if you go under fluid effects under the ocean, you've got this thing called create wake. And what that will do is it will create this simple little spherical volume, and then you can animate that through the water in order to create kind of ripple effects. So that's basically what I did here. So if I rendered this out without the wakes, it would just be the ocean itself, but by rendering it out with these wakes, and you can see I've got one basically set up for each of these objects as well as the tree. What that allowed me to do is basically create kind of displacement of the water, or at least fake. So anyway, you can see that here basically right in here in the water. So I've got this kind of little ripple, or this little wave that kind of surrounds the gumdrop. Nothing fancy, again, just a super simple trick. It worked. You know, it's not perfect. If this were moving, if this were an animation, it might not be quite as accurate, but because it's 2D, you can get away with a lot of little tricks like that. So another thing I wanted to show real quick was these gumdrops. I wanted these gumdrops to actually look like they were on the terrain. And I also wanted to have some control over the placement. So I did a couple little nifty tricks there that I can show. So let's hide the water, covered that, and let's bring back, let's actually hide, well, I can't hide the foreground because that's part of it. I'll talk about these dividers in a second, and I'll talk about the background trees in a second. So let's bring back the terrain. There we go. So you can see that I've got these objects, and these objects actually, you can see these little balls are actually not technically on the terrain. I actually raised them up. And I also did a little trick where I went in and I kind of faked the shadows. Oops, sorry. Let's actually pull back. Also faked the shadows with copies of themselves. But anyway, the way I started was I basically got my terrain from the point of view that I wanted to render it. And then I just went in and I made it live. I just turned it into a live surface. So you just click on this Make Live. And then I just simply went in and I did a Create Curve. So I just went in here and I went bam, 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 bam. And I just dropped down some points. Those dropped down directly on my terrain. I didn't really care about the depth of it because I was just, again, faking this in 2D. So actually, if you hide the foreground here, what I can do is just create that curve. And then I can come in here and I can create a real simple object. So I can just say, well, I want to take a sphere, and I basically want to drop that down onto the curve. So I take the sphere and then I just go under animation and I just quickly go in here and I basically set that as a motion path. So I'll just say set motion, or rather attach to motion path. And now you can see that that follows the path, and of course my scale is off. So now I just go in and I basically scale this to a value that is a little bit more appropriate. Let's say actually something more like 0.2. And then once I get that set up right, then I just quickly go in here and I set my animation. Well, one thing I want to do is make this linear. So I go to the graph editor and you can see that I have an ease in, ease out. I don't want that because I want them to be evenly spaced on the curve. So I just set that to linear, and then I go back to my 3D view and we'll take a look at what this looks like. Again, I just want to create snapshots of that. So I just come in here under my animate and I say I want to create an animation snapshot, and bam, there I've got all my objects along the curve. So that's too many, so if I don't like that, I just undo that. I go back to create animation snapshot, and I had that increment set to 0.5. I might want to have this set to 0.8 instead. And now you can see I get them more evenly spaced. So this is just trial and error. I basically just did this a few times until I figured out what I wanted my spacing to be. And then, bam, I've got my spheres on that curve. Now, I could have them just stay bound to the curve if I want to, or if I want to massage these, I can just delete the curve. And then these all get grouped together. So this is where I started to do some fakery. I basically want to go in here now, and I'm going to turn off my live object, and then I'm going to pull these back a little bit. And then I want to just kind of start to scale these up, or rather push these up, and then start to, scale these relative to my view if I need to. You can also go in here, obviously, and just center the pivot, do something like that. And then, go in and grab the individual ones and just quickly come in here and say, well, okay, those need to be each a little bit smaller. Whoops. Let's modify their pivots once more. There we go. Now they're each scaling relative to one another. But one thing that you can do once you get it to this point, let's say you decide at some point you want to change the placement. So like right now you can see that these are all kind of like evenly spaced, and they're also different depending on the perspective. So I can just set my perspective the way I want it. And there's this awesome little tool that I don't use very often, but it's really handy when you do need it. And it's the soft select across objects. So if you turn on your soft select, and then you go in here to your soft select options, you can basically take this and you can turn it into an object mode. And it's super cool, a very unique feature, I think. It basically now allows you to create a fall off across those objects. So now I can take the object and I can start to push and pull these around, and I can create these kind of nice fall off effects. I don't really need this guy right here, but I can basically go in here and I can start to shift the distribution, and then you just hold B to change that, and now I can basically really start to kind of refine the distribution and layout of these different spheres. So let's scale that up a little bit, something like that, and then I grab this guy here, scale that down, and maybe kind of push that in. Maybe grab these guys, kind of push those out, and anyway, before too long you can get this perfect placement exactly how you want it. And so that's basically how I went from a simple sphere and a curve to a nice little kind of controlled layout structure of the foreground, dots that I had before. So anyway, that's how I came up with this really kind of nice curved shape from simple objects. So anyway, you get the basic idea there. Handy little trick. Again, that's just part of soft select. And then the last thing that I did that I wanted to show is just a rendering trick for creating depth. I really hate dealing. I'm not a rendering expert, so I really hate dealing with a bunch of rendering parameters. So rather than going in and trying to create some kind of volumetric fog, or rather than trying to deal with some kind of depth map compositing or whatever, basically what I did is I just created a bunch of dividers. So I took that one tree in the foreground, and then I just copied that and made different kind of versions of it, and then modified the textures for each, just so I have a little bit of variation. So just so you can see that, I can, whoops, let's actually unselect that. Just so you can see that, I can basically, just show you kind of what these look like. So these are nothing fancy. These don't even need to be fancy, because in reality they're way off in the distance. So again, what I did is I took these dividers, and these dividers, one at a time, just have a simple mask on them. So if you actually just take a look at the mask that's associated with this, it's just a simple ramp, basically. So if I graph that, there we go. So this simple ramp serves as a mask for color, but then I've also got one for transparency, which basically does the same thing. So if I grab that and then mask that. Anyway, you get the basic idea. One is ramping transparency, one is ramping color. But they each have a slightly different value. So I've got the foreground, which you can't actually see right now in the viewport. And then I've got the midground. So that the foreground masks off, 4, 5, 6 trees. I've got the midground, which masks off a bunch of other trees, probably 10, 15, and then I've got the background plane, which masks off all the rest. So basically what that allows me to do is create depth, essentially, and then I can control the transparency, a gradient transparency, for each one of those planes. So essentially, again, have my full trees mask out the farthest ones, mask out the ones in the middle, and then mask out the ones in the foreground. And what I end up with is this kind of nice depth. So that's what you see here. Like if you notice, these are the ones in the foreground, and then you have a midground and a background, and then I've got kind of a gradient depth with some purple in there just to make it look a little bit more otherworldly. And then from there, I rendered all that out. Oh, and the gumdrops are just simple squashed spheres with a layered shader. The layered shader basically is a simple noise pattern comped onto a simple blend. Nothing fancy there, with a bump map obviously to separate the sugar coating from the blend. From there I rendered it all out, and then I just sent that over to my wife. And then here in Photoshop, this is where my wife does her Photoshop magic. So obviously she does the basic stuff like, the font and whatnot. But then we also go in and, we position all of the characters, do a little bit of editing. You'll notice we scaled up her head a little bit so that she looks a little more cartoony. But then we also go in and we add shadows. So we got a little shadowing under the feet just to make them look a little bit grounded, and then a broader shadow, which just gives it a little bit more, again, grounding. So kind of a primary and a secondary shadow. My head, of course, has to be scaled up to look super cartoony, so I'll look a little more like Fix-It Felix. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the 2D editing. And the end result is what I think is a pretty cool little holiday card. So anyway, that's holiday card how-to, Roselle Holiday Card how-to 2013/14. I hope you guys appreciate it. It's a silly little tradition, but we've been doing it for 16 years, so we can't stop now. And if you actually go to my website, StephenRoselle.com, there's a /holiday section. I don't have a lot there except for the holiday cards, but you can actually see the history of all the cards that we've done. So obviously this is 2013, 2012, we were country music stars, going all the way back to our original KISS days. Anyway, silly tradition, but fun. Of course, we have to incorporate the kids as well. So that's it. You guys have a wonderful holiday, and hopefully everybody will have a great 2014. We'll see you in the new year. Bye.